one of the first phenomena of the monarch that is threatened is the migration. The migration definitely will be the first thing that could be extinct. And we cannot take that lightly in any way, because there will be like huge ecological implications. And also it has traditional implications. We're talking about affecting a culture of a nation, which is Mexico. So we cannot just say it'll be okay if that happens. We need to ensure that when we're talking about conserving the monarch butterfly, we're talking about the ecology of the monarch butterfly as well.
Hey folks, what's happening? Welcome to Your Forest. My name is Matthew Kristoff, and on this podcast, we talk about the environment and the science of sustainability. Now, today's episode is more of a classic episode. We're going just to conservation, straight up conservation, right? And today's episode is all about monarch butterfly conservation. So to have that conversation, this is not one I've ever had before. I know nothing about them. Up in northern Canada, I don't really experience them. So it's something that I'm unfamiliar with and I was excited to learn about. So to have this conversation, I brought on the National Wildlife Federation's Senior Director of Wildlife Hunting and Fishing Policy, Mike Leahy, as well as the National Wildlife Federation's Director of Climate Resilience and Habitats Program, Rebecca Quiñonez-Piñón. And together, they're able to, 1-2 punch this conversation and really give us the full breadth of detail about what's going on with monarchs. What is the actual threat to them? Where is the problem lying? How can people help? Because apparently they can, but also, spoiler, there's a lot of ways in which you might think you're helping that you're really not. So let's make sure that we're helping in the right way. So listen to the episode. You can find out exactly how to do that. So as it turns out, the monarch butterfly is a truly amazing species, not only visually, but in their migration and in their interconnectedness with culture and humans and everything, our connection to nature. And I mean, they make one of the longest migrations in the insect kingdom. It's amazing, over like 4,000 to 5,000 kilometers every winter. It's nuts. And apparently it has an enormous cultural importance to the people of Mexico, as well as being responsible for introducing so many people to the concept of nature. And so today we're diving all the way in to the ecology and cultural importance of monarch butterflies, why they're at risk, their political status, why that might need to change, and what we can do to help. Sponsors for this episode, West Fraser is the #1 sponsor for 2025. They've been with me since nearly the very beginning, and I could not do this without them. Thank you, West Fraser, for all your support over the years. Also, Greenlink Forestry has been with me since the very beginning. Thank you, Greenlink, for all of your support. Couldn't do it without you. Now, without any further messing around, let's dive into monarch butterflies. What's their deal? What are they about? Why are they important? Why should we care? Here we go. Yeah, monarchs is not something that's been on my plate. It's not something I've focused on, so this is a good opportunity for me to learn something new and explore a realm of conservation that I've previously not been acquainted with. So first of all, I got to get to know you both just a little bit. And so if you don't mind, Mike, I'll start with you. If I can just get you to kind of introduce yourself.
Well, first off, thanks, Matthew, for the opportunity for Rebecca and I to be on the podcast representing the National Wildlife Federation. I am the Senior Director for Wildlife Hunting and Fishing Policy here at the Federation, and we have over 7 million members and supporters, and we have a primary state affiliate in each state and almost every territory, which is a conservation partner on the ground, and the monarch butterfly is one of our flagship species, so I'm just excited to have an opportunity to work on them, even though they're in trouble and declining, and I approach these issues from a policy lens as a lawyer by training, but I also studied natural resources management as an undergrad, and so I have some of the science background as well. And just like so many people, grew up with monarchs around. I grew up outside of Detroit, and there were monarchs all over the place in the yard and in the neighborhood, and we really enjoyed seeing them and chasing after them and things like that. And so while I think it's important that we conserve and recover all of our native species and wildlife and insects, even the less charismatic one, this is one, is one that I have a personal connection to, and a lot of people have a personal connection to based on our youth in particular, I think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. No, that totally makes sense. They're a pretty charismatic species, without a doubt. Before we move on to Rebecca, can you give us a brief detail on what exactly the National Wildlife Federation does, just so people are aware?
We're the nation's largest conservation organization, and we work on pretty much anything and everything related to wildlife and species conservation and ecological conservation and how humans interact with wildlife and ecosystems and recreate and manage natural resources. So all of those issues, we were founded in 1936. We've been around for a long time, and we consider ourselves a big tent organization where we welcome everyone who has an interest in conservation and wildlife and the environment. We have a lot of hunters and anglers within our membership. We have gardeners, foresters, general wildlife advocates. Anyone and everyone is welcome. And, we really kind of embrace that and take that to heart. Our mission is to support thriving populations of all wildlife. And so, we strive towards that in everything that we do.
Awesome. Thank you for that. Appreciate that. Great. Yeah, it's a good rundown. Obviously, me being a Canadian, I'm not super familiar with the National Wildlife Federation, so it's good to figure it out, right? A lot of people in the podcast are from all over, so they might not be familiar. All right, thank you. Now, Rebecca, how about you? Just give us a little bit of introduction and how you got involved with the National Wildlife Federation on monarch conservation.
I thank you as well for the opportunity and having us here. I have to tell you that a really good chunk of my heart was left in Canada.
Oh, okay.
I lived there for 9 years. So,
nice.
Yeah, I love Canada. So
very cool.
It's really nice to be here and have this conversation. Yeah, my background is in forest hydrology. I received a PhD from the University of Calgary in geomatics engineering, where I focused on forest hydrology. And my connection with monarchs is indeed related to forest and forest hydrology specifically. So after getting my PhD and had the opportunity to start seeking collaboration with other colleagues, I ended up meeting this great group in Mexico working on the reforestation of the Monarch Butterfly Biosphere Reserve. The rest is history, right? It was indeed quite clear that conserving the monarch and conserving the forests, it was a key element not only for Mexico, but also for the U.S. and Canada. Mm-hmm. And after working several years on monarch conservation and forest restoration in Mexico, with a U.S.-based nonprofit organization, I had the great opportunity to come to the National Wildlife Federation to continue working on monarch conservation.
Okay.
And at this point, I'm mostly focusing on the science portion of it, the conservation, working with other groups here in the U.S. on setting up the standards and the strategies and actions for the conservation of the monarch.
Matt, I did want to mention that we have a partner in Canada, the Canadian Wildlife Federation, that does similar work. They work coast to coast in Canada, trying to create a brighter future for wildlife in Canada. And that's a quick Google search if you or anybody else wants to check them out. But they're a great partner north of the Medicine Line.
Perfect. Awesome. Thank you for that. Yeah, I appreciate it. Yeah, I was aware of that. I didn't know that they were an affiliate. So that's cool. Good to know. Awesome. So, all right. Thank you for both of you for that. And I want to dive now into obviously let's jump straight into monarchs, right? And I think first and foremost, so I grew up in Edmonton. I'm not familiar with the monarchs. I don't believe I've ever seen them. I'm not sure if they come as far north as northern Alberta, but so I wanted first to dive into, I want to start with Rebecca, actually. Why is it that the monarch butterfly is such a charismatic species? Like it seems to capture so much attention, right? So what is it about the monarchs that seems to capture so much public attention and scientific attention?
That's a great question. And we're still trying to fully answer that. So, I mean, the monarch itself has created this amazing emotionally connection with humans. Mm-hmm. And it is one of our first experiences when it comes to connecting with nature.
Oh, okay.
For some reason, the monarch has that amazing ability to embed that memory in during our childhood. And it is the conversation that you will hear constantly with people. I'm sorry that you have not experienced them in Edmonton.
Yeah.
But it's if you go a little bit south of Edmonton, you will see monarchs. I mean, there are some places like on Okotoks where, for instance, hoping that monarchs will show up at some point. And it is that emotional connection and experience and connection with nature that the monarch creates. Many others, especially here in the U.S., have had the opportunity to have the monarch in the classroom. It is commonly used to teach children in the classroom about the life cycle of a butterfly. And the monarch is one that has been in the classroom forever. And you hear many adults talking about growing up and having in the classroom monarchs and seeing them growing. And so it's that connection with nature.
Gotcha.
In Mexico, there is other level of connection, which has to do with our traditions. And that goes back to hundreds of years ago when even, our pre-Hispanic cultures had that connection with other butterflies, not only the monarch, and consider butterflies the souls of those who departed. And now through history and colonization, etc., has turned into, be the monarch as part of the celebration of the Day of the Dead. And it's huge. So you will see in altars in Mexico a representation of the monarch. And interesting enough, the altars always integrate the orange and black and white colors, which is just a big coincidence. But it happens, and the monarch is there. And to make it even more amazing, the migration of the eastern monarch population during the fall traditionally arrives around the Day of the Dead, which is November the 2nd, to Mexico. So it's just amazing how this monarch has embedded in many people's life. And in terms of the science, it's really important because, as Mike was saying, it's a flagship species, has become as well a sentinel species, we could call it. Others indicate that the monarch is an umbrella species because the monarch that has caught so much attention from the public and the scientific community is also telling us the dire situation that many other native pollinators are living. And not only in the US, but also in Canada and Mexico. So Canada has listed the monarch as an endangered species already. And that can tell us that Canada is as well paying attention to the situation of the monarch.
Gotcha. I was going to ask, about the cultural importance in Mexico of monarchs, because I assumed that there was probably something, but I didn't know any of that. And that's fascinating that it's how culturally important it is. And like, of course, that's going to have a big pull charismatically, right? And that's really interesting. And that pull for it being the first real connection for a lot of kids to nature. And yeah, that's awesome. Yeah, I feel like I missed out a little bit, but we'll see. I'll make my way down south here, and we'll we'll see if we can't find some. So,
but I'm sure that you have a species, a native species that, I mean, if I ask you, you will say, right, this is the species that created that connection with me in nature.
Yeah, no, absolutely. That's a good question. A specific species. So I grew up edging up against the boreal forest. So my backyard was the bush, right? So yeah, I guess a lot of, I don't know if I have a specific species in mind, but the forest in general, right? Like the white-tailed deer, we always had black bears in the backyard digging up the garden, and my dad ended up putting a fence around the garden at one point because all the deer were in there chewing up all the bulbs, and squirrels, obviously. And yeah, there's always something, and grouse, and yeah, there's all kinds of cool stuff. So yeah, everyone's got that something that pulls them into that, right? And yeah, it's a great question. Yeah, and I also wanted to ask too about something that stands out in the monarchs. You mentioned the migration, and I've seen those pictures of I believe it's the breeding grounds down in Mexico, where you get these pictures of just, I don't know how many, hundreds of thousands of these massive butterflies just totally painting the trees from top to bottom. And that pictures, like those videos are so iconic, and that has to be a huge pull. Is that a common occurrence in Mexico during that breeding season, that they just congregate like that?
Well, that would be the overwintering season.
Or overwintering, sorry. I don't know what I'm talking about. That's why you're here.
No worries. Yeah, that's perfect. That's why we're here. So that would be the overwintering season, and that was very common since the 70s, when the Monarch Butterfly Biosphere Reserve, or those grounds, the overwintering grounds, were discovered. Which, let me tell you, this is 50 years since those grounds were discovered, and it was just, I think it was January 9th. And by the way, it was a Canadian scientist who hired some citizen scientists who finally found those overwintering grounds in Mexico. And so it was very common, and it was just massive. The number of monarchs, it was definitely massive, in the millions. And and unfortunately, because the situation with habitat loss and fragmentation, the excessive use of pesticides, and now the extreme weather, aka climate change, those numbers have steadily declined, and we continue to see those declines, which are extremely worrisome. And the worst declines started back in 2014. But definitely before that landscape full of monarchs and monarchs roosting in the different tree species in that mixed pine-oyamel forest, it was a common sighting.
Oh, okay. So this is one specific area we're talking about.
Yes,
so it's one. So how big is this area that it went unfounded for so long by modern society?
That's a great question. Now, after several years, and after the 70s, it was around the 80s that it was declared a federal protected area in Mexico, and then named the Monarch Butterfly Biosphere Reserve. And it goes in the thousands of acres at this point. Oh, okay. And there is the core zone, and there is the buffer zone as well. And within the core zone, there are very specific sites. I can't tell you exactly what's the size of those areas, but those are selected areas that are preferred by the monarchs to create their colonies when they are overwintering. And some of them are very well known, like El Rosario, for instance, and Chinqua are two of the most popular, because that's where people can go and visit and see the monarchs during the overwintering time.
Yeah, like immediately that paints a picture of how vulnerable the monarchs could be to any kind of climate change or any kind of disturbance, right? If they're very dependent on this one area that's only a few thousand hectares, or sorry, a few thousand acres, like you said, then like that's not a large area. And if that goes away, they go away. Like that obviously paints a very dire picture of like, yeah, this is delicate, right? So. Yeah.
Indeed.
So, okay, we have this big, massive butterfly. It has this ridiculous migration from Canada down to Mexico. They do it every year. They're culturally very important, and in America and in Mexico for bringing people into nature. So this is obviously this iconic charismatic species. And one of the first things I ran into when I was looking into this idea was that there was, if you Google monarch butterfly conservation, there's immediately a bit of just some confusion, or there's some, like, it almost seems like there's different ideas of like what's going on and whether or not they should or shouldn't be considered a threatened species and that kind of thing. There's a bit of a debate scientifically. And I just wanted to try and clear up why that might be, because I want to make sure that people understand where these different ideas are coming from, and just so we can kind of navigate it and understand it and go forward in full context, you know?
Yeah, I'll start from a policy perspective and then maybe turn it over to Rebecca about the scientific side of things. But the Endangered Species Act is supposed to be a law that's based on the best available science. So these should all be science-based decisions, not based on politics or economics.
Right.
The reality of humanity, of course, is those issues leak into things sometimes, but there has been a solid effort over the decades to keep the Endangered Species Act as close to the science as possible, and listing decisions in particular should be based on the science. And so, regardless of these other considerations, whether or not the science indicates a species should be listed as a threatened species or an endangered species, that's the decision that the Fish and Wildlife Service should propose.
Okay.
And so we feel like they followed the science here, and we concluded, Rebecca and our science team took a look at the science and concluded that the species deserves to be listed as a threatened species. And Rebecca, you may have more to say on that. I just wanted to make the point that the Endangered Species Act is set up ideally to be purely based on science. And then once a species gets the status that it needs, then all these other issues, economics, politics, impacts can be managed and sorted out.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service goes through a very well thought out process to gather the best science available and commercial information available to go through what is known as the species status assessment. And we agree with the outcome that came out from the latest version of the species status assessment of the monarch butterfly. One of the first phenomena of the monarch that is threatened is the migration.
Okay.
And the migration definitely will be the first thing that could be extinct. And we cannot take that lightly in any way.
Right.
In any way. Because there will be like huge ecological implications. And also it has traditional implications. We're talking about also affecting a culture of a nation, which is Mexico.
Right.
So we cannot just say that it'll be okay if that happens. We need to ensure that when we're talking about conserving the monarch butterfly, we're talking about conserving the ecology of the monarch butterfly as well, which includes making sure that the monarch has healthy breeding size populations and large enough for them to perform and have a whole migration. As you were saying, it's a massive, long migration that will need a steady, healthy, and large population to survive and get to their overwintering grounds. Overwinter there and then be prepared to breed, return to the north during the spring. And then, so the process is complicated, and the impact at any level, whether it's the species and the breeding population size, or the migratory population size, or the overwintering population size, everything is connected.
Totally.
And none of these pieces can be missed or lost.
Totally. Of course, that makes sense. That's ecological principles, right? Like you need all the parts, you need all the cogs and wheels, as Aldo Leopold said, right? So I do want to, just before we move on, I want to get more into the migration, and especially the pressures, or whatever the problem is with the migration status and why it's such an issue with climate change or whatever. Before we move on from that, though, I just want to, because I think there's still I'm not even really clear why there was such a debate, even in the scientific community, or seemingly from my cursory look into it, about why was there any kind of debate as to listing them as threatened? Why was that something of concern to some scientists?
I can't speak to the scientific debate, but there's always a debate over Endangered Species Act listings. The Endangered Species Act has unfortunately become politicized, and some people view it as controversial. So, that bleeds into it, make it a normal part of doing business.
Politics, gets in the way of most things, right? Fair enough. So, that's it. Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, I do feel like a lot of conservation issues run into that stuff, right? Like, is this what we should be spending our money on? And it's like, well, that's not what we're asking, right? So, what other criteria? What other criteria for like the scientific criteria, Rebecca, for meeting the threatened species?
Well, it depends of the species. If we focus on the monarch, definitely one thing that has been a really good indicator of the status of the monarch butterfly has been the population size.
Okay. And
until this point, the most adequate, the best way to estimate the numbers on an annual basis is counting the monarchs that overwintering, because that's where we know that the largest size of the population is concentrated in one single place.
Totally.
I mean, the monarch is what is known in ubiquitous.
Yeah, that's right. Yep.
Ubiquitous.
Yep.
Thank you.
You got it.
So, got it. So, and you can find it anywhere, right? Almost anywhere. In the U.S., you can find the monarch in up to 48 states. Of course, along the south portion of Canada and in Mexico concentrates in the specific area. And with the western monarch population is the western side of the Rocky Mountains, where you will find the breeding sites. And then the overwintering sites are in the southwest portion, the California groves. So once more, we know that the whole population of that specific year will concentrate in the overwintering grounds. And that's how we monitor what's the status of the monarch for that specific year. So that's one of the indicators.
Okay.
And of course, there are other indicators that can help us to determine what's the status of the monarch. Among them is the presence or not of native milkweed, which is the only host plant species for the monarch. Additionally to other elements of a native habitat for monarchs, which are the nectar plants, for instance, and trees for roosting during the migration season as well. So those should be along the migration pathways. We talk about milkweed, but plant milkweed, but actually at the end there should be a holistic approach where we are seeing the whole habitat.
Totally.
And that's what it is taken into account to determine how the monarch is doing. And then, of course, we monitor extreme weather events that at this point have shown that they are having an impact not only on the survival of the monarch, but also on the condition of the native habitats,
Right.
which have been devastated by climate change, and then the monarch struggles as well. And the excessive use of pesticides, there are some scientific papers that have been published in the past that have shown the correlation between the declines of the monarch in some specific years and the excessive use of pesticides.
Okay.
So there are clear indications of what we need to keep in mind in order to ensure that we can recover the species.
Totally. Okay. So we have this big, beautiful, charismatic species, culturally important. It has a huge migration. It requires a specific overwintering ground that is small and at risk. The migration being so long, they run into a lot of hazards along the way, like pesticides and maybe the standard suite of anthropogenic, disturbances that cause problems for a lot of wildlife. And so it's this obviously a very delicate species that requires a light touch and requires some real attention, right? You mentioned earlier that I kind of want to dispel some of the misconceptions, right? So you mentioned earlier about the migration being one of the biggest issues. So, because I did read that, I was reading earlier that it wasn't necessarily that the repopulation wasn't happening, but that there was a lot of mortality along the migration route, more than previous decades, and that might be the number one contributor to the decline. Is that true, or is that a misconception? I don't know. You tell me.
Well, there are papers that are indicating exactly what the numbers are telling us, and some published research is indicating that about 3% of the eastern monarch population perishes during the migration.
Oh.
So it's 3% of the total.
Okay.
So the number at this point might be considered important because the monarch continues to decline.
Okay.
But at the end, it's not like 50% of the population.
Okay.
So if we go by the numbers and what the science, the research has indicated, is 3%.
Oh, that doesn't seem like a lot. That seems like, for an insect, right? That doesn't seem like that's all that detrimental. So what are the main pressures? What is the main issue here that's causing such a hard time for the populations, for the monarch population?
Well, it's a series of events that are happening all together at once, which is once more the decline of the native habitats in the breeding areas, the migration pathway, and the overwintering sites. And then, which is exacerbated by climate change. And then, the use of pesticides. And, in this case, we are not only talking about the use of pesticides in rural areas, we're talking about use of pesticides even at home in our gardens.
Oh, okay.
I mean, we do not need to use pesticides in our gardens or at home. And that has a tremendous effect not only on the monarch, but many other native pollinators. And we are trying to spread the word, outreach, and ask everyone to avoid the use of pesticides at home. I mean, there are other ways to control insects inside our homes if that's the goal. Or find other methods that are more environmentally friendly. Yeah.
And I would assume, before we move on from the pesticides, I would assume, because some people might assume that if they're not using insecticides specifically, that it might be okay. But if I am to understand this correctly, you're talking pesticides, which means for weeds, for whatever it might be. It's a broad, stop spraying chemicals on your lawn to get rid of dandelions, and that'll help the monarchs.
Absolutely. Which, I mean, dandelions, are part of the landscape, and why are we getting rid of them? That's another conversation, but definitely herbicides is, because many of those herbicides that we're using are systemic. They remain in the plant species, and nectar plants, and at the end will be absorbed by the pollinators if they are feeding on those plants. And host plants are also affected, and any insect that relies on that plant species as a host plant will be affected as well. So yes, Mike.
I thought it was interesting and telling. The Fish and Wildlife Service, in their proposal to list the monarch butterfly as threatened, they basically asked for a lot of input on how to address pesticides. They identified it as a threat, but it's a complex threat. And so, rather than proposing a concrete set of actions for addressing the threat, they kind of opened the door and said, help us figure this out. We know this is an impact and complex, and we're going to need some help figuring out how to deal with it. And I also thought it was telling on related to some of the earlier discussion, what the Fish and Wildlife Service identified as the main needs for recovering the population. And the number one need is to increase the amount of milkweed and nectar plants, but in monarch breeding and migratory areas. So, not just the migratory areas, but breeding as well. But that seems like the main need is, they need a lot more milkweed and nectar plants. They also identified protecting the overwintering habitats, which I think is the easiest part of this because they're so discrete and they're identified and, we know where they are and how to protect them. Then they flag the insecticides and herbicides. And then it was also interesting, they identified maintaining public support to this conversation we had earlier about the nature of these decisions sometimes being controversial. There is widespread support for monarch butterflies, and but we need to maintain that and take steps to maintain it. And it's really interesting that this is known, but the Fish and Wildlife Service identified this as well, that everybody can contribute to the monarch butterfly recovery, or almost everybody, because they're so widespread. And you can plant milkweed or nectar plants in your yard, or even at your apartment on your balcony, and that can all contribute, right? So it's kind of it's a huge problem, but it's a unique opportunity for people to engage directly in recovering the species that is in trouble, but one that we also widely enjoy and appreciate.
Totally. Yeah, that makes sense. And I did notice that there was a bit of misunderstanding about the planting of milkweeds too, and that it needs to be specifically native milkweeds, right? And that there was some discord that I was reading where they were talking about people are planting milkweeds that might be from Asia or wherever, and that those actually they're not helpful, right? So is that the case? So we need to be planting a lot more specifically native milkweeds, and that will help, or is there, or does it matter?
We prefer to encourage people to plant native species. It is well known that non-native species that are introduced to native habitats, for instance, at some point, because they lack of their natural or their biological controllers on their own native space, they tend to get crazy and they become invasive. Yeah. So we encourage people to seek for native milkweeds. Okay. In the US, we have over 70 species of native milkweeds that are available for people to buy them. I know that in Canada, there are also some native milkweeds that can be acquired and plant in your gardens. There are some species that have become very popular, non-natives, because they once more, they lack of their biological controllers. So they go wild, they are crazy, and it's easy to grow them. It's easy to not maintain them. Yeah. And unfortunately, the monarchs like them because, of course, it's a hosted plant and they are able to lay their eggs on those plants. But there are some drawbacks to that we have seen with some of those species. Some research has indicated that, for instance, those non-native species in very specific areas where there are high temperatures and somehow has become toxic for the monarchs.
Oh.
Another issue that we have seen and has been also documented is that, for instance, the tropical milkweed, which is also very popular because it could become a perennial plant, especially in those places where there are no like harsh winters, tend to concentrate a protozoa that is a big pest for the monarch. And affects the monarch in many ways. And normally the monarchs that are affected by this protozoa, which is the Ophrysistis electrocera, they are not viable. So we have seen those issues, and we encourage people not to use the plants.
Gotcha.
The Ophrysistis electrocera can be found also on native species. However, during the fall and the winter, the native species will go dormant, which help them to remove and get rid of that protozoa. So they sprout the bloom during the spring, and they are clean and ready to receive the monarchs during their migration north back to the U.S.
Gotcha. So yeah, it's more complicated than just plant milkweed. You do have to make sure it's native to planting. So planting tropical ones or non-natives could actually cause harm. Could do the opposite of what you're trying to do. So go the extra mile, pay the extra money if you have to get the right ones. Because otherwise it's just a problem. That makes sense. I feel like that's a common issue, right? In conservation is public engagement, and then a lack of clarity around what exactly that public engagement should look like to be effective, right? I think that's those misconceptions can cause issues, right? And so I also found it did seem when I was looking into this issue that there is a large population of people out there, public folks, that do like monarch rearing, and they're focused a lot on planting milkweeds, and they're trying to like really seriously contribute to the conservation. I wanted to ask about that kind of engagement. Is rearing monarch butterflies, is that wise? Does that help? What's the situation there?
Yeah, I mean, initially the monarch was used in the classroom. So,
right.
And it's a couple of monarchs per classroom, so the children can experience and be, captivated by this life cycle of a butterfly.
Very important, right? That's a huge draw to pulling people into this concept of conservation. So that's a huge plus. Yeah.
Yeah. However, I mean, and there are many people who have their heart in the right place. And they truly believe that, bringing hundreds of, individuals, let's say eggs of monarchs into their homes and raising them in their homes, it's going to benefit, the species, because they are removing them from the wild and they are protecting them from predators and the weather. However, like any other wildlife species, the monarch requires to be exposed to those environmental factors, the natural factors that they will face throughout their life cycle, and also ensure that they have the proper light while they are developing from egg into larva and then into the pupa and then finally an adult. So all those steps or stages for the monarch are crucial to happen outside in the wild. So there are some concerns that doing this raiding of monarchs at a large scale as has been happening can indeed somehow affect the species. There are other research studies that have shown that monarchs that are raised indoors, they tend to not have the proper compass or understanding of the change of light and in directions, and they get lost during the migration. So there has been already a lot of documentation indicating what the issues with raising monarchs at home are. Gotcha. And Mike, I think there is something on the 4D rules regarding this. Is that the proposed 4D rules from the Fish and Wildlife Service?
There is. The Fish and Wildlife Service has proposed that Small scale collection is exempt from prohibitions with a limit of 250 max. I think there's questions over that number and whether that's too many butterflies, but Fish and Wildlife Service has acknowledged this as an issue and basically said captive rearing, education, scientific research is okay, but at a smaller scale, impacting and utilizing a smaller number of monarchs. If it gets beyond that, then it's going to start having bigger impacts.
Right. So it's not actually helpful for the population, but it might be helpful in bringing attention, getting people educated into, and connected to nature, but it's not actually going to help bring the monarchs back. Because, if you think about raising human children, it's the same thing, right? Like if you shelter your kid the whole time and do everything for them, they're going to turn out to be useless human beings. So you need to, there's a certain amount of risk involved, and there needs to be adversity and challenges. And so why not? It makes total sense to me, right? Can't remove them from their environment, or you take a captive grizzly bear or black bear and then try to put it into a national park. You're like, that's not going to go well. Like that bear's just going to end up in garbage cans munching on people's leftover hamburgers, right? Like it's just, you're creating the wrong type of wildlife. So yeah, that totally checks out. But I do see that it could be very, very important for the human recognition and connection, and like kind of a pathway into understanding conservation issues and understanding, the amazingness that is the concept of butterfly rearing, right? Of like going from an egg to a larva, to a pupa, to a butterfly. Like that transformation is a classic one for kids to just be in awe. So I can see that being really important for sure. But yeah, that totally makes sense. So yeah, plant native milkweeds, not so much for rearing unless it's for educational purposes. Is there anything else because it does seem like something that people are really attracted to, right? So the big one is just keep planting native milkweeds, and that's how you can help for the public, okay?
Yeah, and we should probably plug our program for doing that. Garden for Wildlife, National Wildlife Federation has a number of programs, and that is one that we've set up that helps people do that in a productive and positive way, and people can find that gardenforwildlife.com. There's other resources as well, but it's basically trying to channel all that energy in the most productive way, and people can get their garden certified, and you meet certain criteria, and I do it. A lot of people do it. It's fun. It's interesting. You learn a lot. So I would recommend that to anybody who's interested.
Absolutely. But a few episodes ago, I recorded with a gentleman who owns a company called Leaf and Limb down in North Carolina. And he wrote this book, and it was all about helping people to not rewild, but I guess rewilding their lawn, I guess, in a way. Yeah. Like, getting away from the lawn, the typical lawn. Like if you're not somebody that spends all their time playing soccer in the backyard, why not create a meadow of native grasses and native flowers, and, not collecting your leaves because a lot of the pollinators use those to overwinter underneath the snow or whatever it might be. Taking your brush, making a brush pile to help insects and birds and whatever, and like creating these. Anyways, the whole conversation was about the importance of native, right? Having native trees and native plants and all that type of stuff, and natural nooks and crannies for insects to hide out and birds to hide out. That all creates this. It's all part of the tapestry that is ecology, right? And all those little things make a big difference. And this is just another one of those examples of like specifically milkweed, but all those other things help as well, right? Having a rich, biodiverse lawn actually makes a difference. And I never would have thought that, right? You would think that, you want to make sure that your landscapes are big, but if the individuals can make sure their lawns are up to snuff, then that makes that makes more of that reconnects the tapestry, right? I guess is a good way to put it. It reconnects it so that there's more pathways for critters to do what they would normally do without cityscapes in their way, right? So, I can totally appreciate the need for native plants and species, and not worrying so much about this Victorian era concept of a manicured lawn, right? Out there with your scissors cutting the edges. So yeah, I appreciated that conversation. That really brought it home to me. And I immediately went home and started growing my own trembling aspen seeds from seed. So it was cool.
That's very cool.
So correct me if I'm wrong, that currently the monarch butterfly, it is currently now listed as threatened, or is going to be? It's on the short list to be listed?
It is proposed to be listed.
To be listed. Okay. So if it gets listed, so they get listed, you talked about it a little bit, Mike, already, about what that would do is it would enable just kind of more focus, more money, more whatever it might be. But like more specifically, what exactly would that do for the species? Or for the effort for conservation, right? How does that get us closer to maintaining them over time?
Yeah, I'll just start with the process. So we are in the public comment period for this proposal, and that comment period goes until March 12th.
Okay.
And the proposal was made in December, and anybody can submit comments, individuals, businesses, organizations, and then the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service will take maybe up to a year to come out with a final determination, probably less than a year. And that will be, the final determination will actually list them as threatened. They could be uplisted to endangered or recommended for an endangered listing. They could withdraw that proposal. So we're submitting comments, encouraging everybody else to submit comments. And again, we support this proposal to list them as threatened. So if that sticks and holds, I think what's really helpful about it is then it provides clear and concrete strategies for recovering. So there will be a recovery plan that will be developed, and it will say these are the steps that are needed to recover the monarch butterfly, and here are actions people can take. Here are actions in this what is known as the 4D rule that we've talked about, the rule for managing them as a threatened species. Here are the actions we're not worried about. The service has already identified a lot of those, such as driving. Some people are like, well, what if I hit a monarch butterfly when I'm driving my car? That's not going to be an issue. It's not what anybody's really looking at. I mean, there's some area where during migration, there's a whole bunch of butterflies getting killed, and, you could manage the speed limit or something. But in general, those are de minimis impacts and activities. But the recovery plan, the listing, is a way to synthesize all these actions and ideas and efforts into one place, and kind of have a framework for getting real serious about recovering the species. There's already been a lot of efforts. There will continue to be a lot of efforts to recover the species, whether or not they're listed. But a listing decision formalizes that, and provides a clear path, ideally, towards recovery of the species. And it it kind of provides coordination among all the different entities. There's already some coordination, but there really could and should be more. So it provides an opportunity for coordination. And the federal government then can then provide additional resources to support the recovery.
Gotcha. That totally makes sense. Yeah. So there's lots of things get mobilized all at once. So, I guess this is a question that we need to ask too, is what does successful monarch butterfly conservation look like? Like, how do we define success in this situation, right? Because that's always something that people worry about, right? Is like, oh, if they get listed, they might never come off, or it'll be this never-ending flow of money or whatever, right? And I just want to dispel some of that and talk about what does success look like, and how do we and what do you imagine that looks like? Not just as a population level, because obviously it would come back to a steady population, but like, how do you imagine that changes the landscape or the migration pathway, or what is that goalpost that we're looking for?
From a policy perspective, that there would be a long-term viable population of monarch butterflies throughout their range for this foreseeable future. You can't predict for eternity, right? But the idea is you're predicting for as far out as you can foresee. That we, the scientists, the managers, think that the species is going to be in a good place for that period of time if all these criteria are met. And so, you need a viable, healthy population. You need their overwintering grounds to be sustained and managed in the case of the monarch butterfly. You need threats to be addressed. So threats to continued loss of their habitat. So you get the habitat up to a point where it can sustain a healthy population of monarch butterflies. And then you have mechanisms in place to maintain that habitat. And that's one of the key elements of delisting, is making sure the regulatory mechanisms are in place to support the long-term recovery once they come off of the endangered species list. And those can be federal agency rules for how you manage federal lands, state agency rules and regulations and laws. There's a whole range of mechanisms that could and should be in place to sustain a recovery. And then, they can come off the list. And then if they decline again and need to go back on, they can go back on the list. And sometimes species do get stuck on the list, maybe longer than some people and some scientists think they need to be. But, it doesn't happen that often. And, it's not a reason not to put species on the list. The idea is that, you get the species to where they need to be and make sure they're going to be in a good place for the foreseeable future. And then they could come off the list or go back on the list if necessary.
Right. So it sounds like it's realistically the focus is on if they go on the list, it forces all of this action into creating a framework that can create the right policies, the right framework so that they don't go back down. The whole point is to change the way that the policy works enough so that we don't have this depopulation again, right? So that totally makes sense. If you put all that effort in the right way and you all of a sudden you have these big programs for planting native milkweeds throughout the migration route or whatever it might be, so that makes sense. So that's where the focus is. That checks out. Yeah. How about you, Rebecca? What does success? What do you imagine success to be, as far as successfully getting the monarchs to a place where they're sustainable again, self-sustainable?
Well, I definitely agree with Mike. That's what we are expecting, to observe a healthy monarch population that we can continue monitoring during the overwintering time. And I would add some metrics to that. We have the Western Monarch Conservation Plan, and we have the Midwest Monarch Recovery Strategy. Okay. And of course, the Western Monarch Plan is focused on the recovery of the Western monarch population, migratory population. And in order to see the recovery of the monarch butterfly, we were expecting to have a 500,000 monarch count running average, which unfortunately we didn't see. At this point. So we're reviewing those numbers and seeing what other actions we can tackle in order to reach out a metric of what it is considered a healthy monarch population size that will support the next generation. With the eastern monarch population, it's the same. In the east, at the monarch butterfly biosphere reserve, it is counted by the size, the acreage, or the area that they occupy.
Oh, okay. So it's not
an actual... a little bit different.
Right.
So in that case, we're talking about the monarch occupying 6 hectares of overwintering sites, which we have not seen happening as well.
Oh, okay.
So
how far away are we from those numbers over the last few years? Far away. Okay. Okay.
There was yes.
So it's not like it's just below the mark. It's significantly below it.
It's significant.
Okay. Okay.
So I agree with Mike, and the National Wildlife Federation aligns with what the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service is proposing, that it is time to protect the monarch under the Endangered Species Act and have more coordinated efforts in federal regulations that can help us to ensure that this species goes on the pathway to recovery. So, which is really important.
it seems like with a species like this that is so delicate, I suppose, as far as the direct impacts that it can feel. Climate change has to throw a wrench into everything, a big wrench, right? So I got to imagine that a lot of this funding that will go into the threatened status would be tackling those future concerns, knowing that, in 50 years, we're going to be in a more dire place ecologically because of climate change, and it's only going to continue to get worse. So there's got to be I'm assuming a lot of research and monitoring involved in that aspect as well, because it's such an unknown, right?
Indeed. I mean, Mike can tell you more about the success of the ESA. I mean, we have really cool examples of what the Endangered Species Act has done for other species that have even been listed as endangered species. So
awesome.
Yeah, I think climate change is the amplifier, though, right? It exacerbates all these other issues and threats, and we've overcome threats with a number of species that have been recovered and removed from the endangered species list. But the monarch gets listed. We're confident that this is a species that we can recover and will recover. And as I mentioned, it's one that everybody can contribute to. It's like, let's all partner together and figure this out and make it happen, because nobody wants to see it not happen. But climate change is kind of an X factor, and it just kind of makes everything a little harder. It amplifies all the other threats, and
absolutely,
it seems like there's ways to address that within the context of the monarch as well. But there's no doubt it's a big concern.
Yeah, that makes sense. I have one final question for both of you, and you can answer it separately. You have the crystal ball. You have the tyrannical powers, and you get to decide what our policy is now, or what our levels are now that we want to reach. Say you're totally in charge of monarch conservation. You have infinite resources. What do? How do you make this work so that this is something that when we put the effort into it, we can build a system that is self-sustaining and can continue to support them and continue to see these animals exist on the landscape? So whoever wants to start, Mike, you want to start politically? What's the policy look like that gets us into a place that you're feeling comfortable and happy, knowing that the wheels will continue to move?
I think it's acres and acres and acres of milkweed, and also nectar plants, which are also important, but the monarchs are uniquely dependent on milkweeds. Not always the most beautiful looking plant at all times of year, but really just incentivizing and encouraging and supporting the expansion of milkweed habitat. That's my simplistic view. There's other needs, there's threats, but from my understanding, and the Fish and Wildlife Service has highlighted this as well, we just need a lot more milkweed out there in a lot more areas. And so whatever we can do to make that happen, garden for wildlife, getting them in people's gardens, encouraging farmers to allow them to grow them, to leave them be, field edges. The energy and transportation companies have stepped up with an agreement called a candidate conservation agreement, where a lot of them have signed up to provide milkweed habitat on the lands and monarch habitat generally on the lands they manage. So, encouraging more of those activities, I think, is really important.
Awesome. Perfect. And Rebecca, you got all the power. What do you do?
That's a great question. Yeah. So, it definitely increased on monarch native habitat, as Mike is indicating, in breeding areas, the migration pathways, as well as roadside habitat, and higher protection in the overwintering sites, which we have the federal jurisdiction for the California groves, but I mean, we can just encourage and have conversations with Mexico about it. And all this habitat created in a way that will increase habitat connectivity, ecological connectivity, will keep the monarchs protected and away from harm during the migration as well. And also ensuring that it's a diverse native habitat for every single space that we're talking about, since the monarch covers so many different habitats throughout their range. And the other portion would be ensuring that whatever habitat restoration activities we do are tackled with a climate lens in a very dynamic way, because climate change is very dynamic, so we need to be prepared for that as well. And not only talking about native habitat in rural areas, but ensuring that we increase our culture of creating native habitats in urban and suburban areas, because there's no other way that at this point, with the large urbanization that every country faces, increase native habitat if we also ensure the effective use of vacant spaces in urban areas.
Right. It's funny how anytime I ask this question, I give people all the power. And you're like, what would you do? They say things that are so reasonable and so accomplishable. It's never this crazy idea of like, we're going to focus all of our energy and time on this one issue. It's always this thing. It's like, well, I would do this very reasonable and effective thing that would totally help. And that's, which I find so refreshing, because you're like, yeah, let's do this. We can do this. Let's do it. So, I want to thank you both for taking the time to do this. This was, it was enlightening for me. I learned a lot, and I'm excited to send this out for folks to listen to and to hopefully get the message out there and get more support going your way.
Thanks for covering this issue, Matt. Really appreciate it. Thanks for bringing us on. Yeah, it was fun.
Yeah, indeed. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you so much for listening. I really enjoyed getting into the deep dive of the monarch butterflies to really understand their plight, understand why they're culturally important, ecologically important. Why should we care, right? It was so good. So thank you to Mike and Rebecca for taking the time to come on here, and also to the National Wildlife Federation for lending me them. And I hope everything goes well, and get out there and help out the monarchs. Let's do this. Thanks a lot for listening. Catch y'all next time. Take it easy.